Hi, I think we're ready to start. Welcome. Thanks for coming out on a snowy night in Anchorage, and thanks for everybody who's joining us on the live stream. I'm David Hewlin. I'm the editor of the Anchorage Daily News, and we are really excited to be able to do this. This is part of a collaboration between the Anchorage Daily News and the Seattle Times on a series of stories that we did this year on what we think is an important topic. First, we'd like to thank the Pulitzer Center for their support of this project from the beginning, as well as the Anchorage Museum for co-sponsoring this event tonight. Now I'd like to introduce Ben Woodard, who's an editor at the Seattle Times.
Thanks, David. Thanks so much. I edit environment coverage at the Seattle Times and was fortunate enough to work on this project with ADN with the support of the Pulitzer Center. I'd like to echo everything David said. It's so great to see so many people who made it out tonight. We weren't quite sure what the turnout would be like, but we have a lot of people on our live stream as well who are listening in, and so we're very excited for that. Also, thank you to our panelists who you'll meet here really soon. We really thank them for turning out for us. I didn't expect to be in Anchorage in December, but here I am, and I even got here today through all the snow, and it's just great to be here. And so we just like to get going. I'd like to introduce the two journalists at the center of this project. Loren Holmes is a multimedia journalist for the Anchorage Daily News. He's a photographer, a video journalist, and drone pilot. And Hal Bernton is a longtime reporter for the Seattle Times. He was also a reporter for the Anchorage Daily News who covered Alaska fisheries, among other topics. Hal has been paying attention to these issues for decades. So thanks again for joining us.
Well, thank you all for being here. And I also have to thank this guy because basically he put up with me in the Bering Sea aboard the Pinnacle and then agreed to return for another round of reporting this summer in Bristol Bay. And Loren is an amazing photojournalist. I felt really fortunate to be with him and for all of his support and work. And I realize now, in retrospect, that when we talked about a warming Bering Sea, and we did it, and we put this event together for December, that we tempted the snow gods to wreak their vengeance upon us. And obviously they have, with the snow dump last week and more than a foot overnight Sunday. So anyhow, thanks again for everybody coming out, and of course our online listeners. So let's get started. As the world warms, the Bering Sea brings us a tale of boom and bust. Last year, a record return of more than 78 million sockeye filled nets and spawning grounds in southwest Alaska's Bristol Bay. There were a few million more that were intercepted actually elsewhere. Meanwhile, western Alaska salmon runs of chum and chinook once again imploded. The upcoming winter snow crab harvest, for the first time ever, has been scrubbed, and the king crab season was shut down for the second year in a row. So we partnered this year to chronicle the stories of the snow crab and Bristol Bay sockeye and explore some of the larger questions of what rising ocean temperatures mean for the Bering Sea and the people who depend on its bounty. This body of water stretching between Alaska and Russia provides some 40% of the U.S. seafood catch. This extraordinary productivity is due in part to the winter ice that pushes down from the Chukchi Sea. And as it melts, the ice helps to support algae. This is one of the cornerstones of the food chain and forms a frigid cold pool along the bottom that offers snow crab protection from predators. In 2018, the ice was almost a no-show. The 2019 ice pack was only a modest improvement. Some climate models models indicate that the Bering Sea's winter ice may be lost entirely by 2070 or 2090, depending on how fast greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere through all the things that humans are doing. While scientists are reaching consensus on the long-term warming trend, there are likely to be plenty of ups and downs along the way. And this past January, as we went aboard the FV Pinnacle to report on what was the smallest snow crab harvest in nearly 40 years, the ice was making quite a comeback in the northern Bering Sea. The Pinnacle's skipper, Mark Casto, often cursed the ice for all the complications and risks it added to their winter harvest. Pots could be lost, and the chill temperatures that came with the ice generated freezing spray that would coat the boat and gear, making the Pinnacle top-heavy, more prone to sink. But this past winter, the ice was also a welcome sight. It offered hope for at least a short-term resurgence in the snow crab populations and the fisheries they sustain. We joined the Pinnacle on January 13th in Dutch Harbor, Unalaska. Just making it out along the Aleutian chain for this rendezvous was a challenge. It took 3 days before there was finally enough of a weather hole. I know many of you have had a similar experience for one skilled pilot to poke through the clouds and land at the airport. While the crew prepped the pots with lines and buoys, Casto checked with his brother Glenn, already fishing in the northern Bering Sea, for intel about where to find crab. We spent 2 days at sea to reach the waters off St. Matthew Island, where the first pots were to be dropped. The Pinnacle this winter had a 209,000-pound quota, a little more than half a boatload, so nothing compared to years past where they would have many boatloads. The hunt for this crab would not be easy. The Pinnacle often crawled through the Bering Sea at speeds of less than 5 miles an hour to minimize the amount of spray that would freeze to the vessel. Still, ice formed. The crew swung mallets. They pounded with crowbars. But the electric jackhammer, shown here in all its glory, worked best. It took nearly 2 weeks to take the quota, as Casto found some narrow veins of crab, but often they would peter out. And all of this was in an area much farther to the north than in most years past, a migration impelled by the absence of crab in so many of the once prime harvest spots in the southern Bering Sea. What happened to all the crab? Federal scientists say there likely was a massive die-off from increased predation, an upsurge in disease, and other effects of warming. One line of inquiry is that the higher sea temperatures increased metabolism rates and the crab's need for food, so many may have starved. There are also plenty of questions about how the fisheries have been managed. Casto was disturbed by recent years past, when as crabbing declined, some skippers would keep dropping pots even in areas where most of the crab ended up being discarded, including those that were legal but smaller than the size favored by processors. Up to 30% of these crab may die, especially when the temps are cold and their legs are brittle. That's the Fish and Game Department's best estimates. I know there's some debate about that, but up to 30%. There also are impacts from other fishing fleets, which are of a lot more concern when snow crab stocks and king crab are at a low point. Bottom trawlers scoop up some crab in pursuit of yellowfin sole and other fish. Pollock fleets deploy much larger nets that often touch the bottom and can crush crab and kill them. After nearly 2 weeks at sea, Casto headed south to unload his catch at St. Paul in the Pribilofs. I was with him during a late night shift in the wheelhouse. We passed one former crabbing ground after another, all these places where I used to find a lot of crab. And I remember Mark let out a lament. Where there used to be hundreds of miles of crab, they're not there. What am I going to tell my grandchildren? That there used to be crab all over the Bering Sea? Well, we had hoped Mark could join us in Anchorage this evening in person. He may make a cameo appearance online a little bit later. He ruptured his Achilles tendon. I won't say how, I'll let him tell you that, and was unfortunately not able to make it. One brief footnote important from our winter reporting: the snow crab faces an uncertain future. This big year for winter ice did result in a much larger cold pool. This year's summer surveys found a continued decline in mature snow crab, but an upsurge in juveniles that, if they survive, could set the stage for a resumption of snow crab harvests several years from now. So in July, I bugged Loren, please come, I pounded on editors to say, let me do this. Some said no. Anyhow, we made it happen. We headed to Bristol Bay to report on what was actually accurately forecast to be the biggest summer catch in more than a century of record keeping. This abundance made it easy for the brown bears to high grade from an ample aquatic buffet. We watched this young guy suck the eggs out of a female, then fling her squirming body to the ground. Daniel Schindler, who's one of our panelists, was with us, and finally he jumped out and said, "Bear, bear," and the bear realized that we were close by and scrammed away. The Bristol Bay sockeye spend much of their lives in the Bering Sea, and studies have found that they, unlike the snow crab, generally do better in years when water temperatures climb a few degrees Fahrenheit. This year's return smashed the previous high set only last year. Now, scientists are trying to get a better understanding of what conditions improve to boost the wild sockeye runs of Bristol Bay. They are also grappling with another question: how warm is too warm? At what point will rising temperatures undermine these runs? We first joined the gillnet fleet in the Naknek-Queepjack fishing district, where skipper Mike Fortner, a crabber-turned sockeye fisherman, was kind enough to host us for a few nights within the cramped confines of his boat. The preseason forecast cited the potential of a harvest of up to 60 million salmon, and shippers struggled to stockpile enough freezer containers to bring the fish to global markets. Mike and his boat, the Twin Tuition, was part of a fleet of some 1,500 gillnet boats that converged in Bristol Bay. Processors flew in thousands of workers. They contracted with an armada of vessels ranging from World War II era scows to Bering Sea crab boats to ferry all these fish back to plants. The harvest, it also involved some 960 beach-based crews that stretched set nets, shown here, into tidal waters. They include Liz Moore, a Seattle woman who returns each year to a Naknek area beach where she spent her childhood summers bringing in fish with her mom, Jan, 4 sisters, and brother, Harry. Now, on the same stretch of beach, she manages a set net operation that includes a half dozen skiffs and a crew of 10 men and women, some of whom come from as far away as New York. And Harry operates a gillnet boat, which I was able to briefly get out on before Loren showed up. And he was a great host as well. The set net harvest requires a lot of muscle. Hand over hand, Moore and her crew pull nets across their skiffs, untangling each salmon from the mesh. They stab the fish with knives to bleed them before they are brought ashore and picked up by processing companies with crews that cruise the beach in trucks. Now, Trident is one of more than 30 companies that process this harvest. Many are based in Naknek, shown here, where seafood companies have built bunkhouse campuses to lodge and feed their workers. As you can see, they're just incredible volumes of fish. Some of the sockeye were filleted and flown out by plane. Most ended up as headed and gutted, frozen, then shipped by sea. So incredible volumes of fish. The total harvest reached 59.5 million sockeye, 26% more than had ever been caught in a single Bristol Bay season. That was enough fish to serve a quarter pound of salmon to every person in America. Though I know that for processors and other folks involved in the industry, one big challenge is how to market all that frozen sockeye. A lot of inventory. In the 1940s, when the crab dipped as low as 4.7 million in terms of the catch, when the sockeye catch dipped as low as 4.7 million fish, industry officials worried about the weak returns. The canneries gave the University of Washington $36,000 to learn more about the runs. More than 75 years later, the industry grants, along with other funding, has enabled generations of scientists and students based out of a network of backcountry camps to produce a remarkable long-term documentation of the freshwater ecosystem that sustains the sockeye. After our time at Naknek, we joined UW researchers, including Daniel Schindler, who will be one of our panelists, at a camp on Lake Nurka in the Wood River drainage. Daniel and other scientists have documented some striking sockeye adaptations. In shallow Hansen Creek, the fish that return are smaller, more slender than most Bristol Bay sockeye. These sleeker bodies give them a better chance of scooting across a gravel bar entry that may be covered with just a few inches of water, and do that without flopping over or getting picked off by bears. The sockeye also, so far, have adapted to the changes in the Bering Sea. Federal surveys from 2001 to 2015 sampled sockeyes crucial first year in salt water. Researchers found that in warming years, they shifted further offshore and shifted their diet from zooplankton to more very young pollock, which is a fish found in great abundance. So in 2019, the Bering Sea surface temperatures climbed as much as 9 degrees Fahrenheit above the long-term average, according to the University of Alaska Fairbanks records. The young sockeye that encountered these conditions appeared to thrive. They formed a big portion of the adults that returned to produce the 2022 record Bristol Bay returns. That same summer of 2019, a heat wave hit Bristol Bay, raising the temperatures at the mouth of some rivers to the point where thousands of the adult sockeye that year died, even as millions made it more to the spawning grounds. It was quite a sight. I heard it described to me by several folks who witnessed it. Such heat waves are expected to become more frequent in the decades ahead, and at some point, rising ocean temperatures may make the Bering Sea less hospitable for sockeye. State and federal scientists also point to the warming of recent years as factors in the decline of the Western Alaska chum and chinook. Also, in warm years in the Columbia River, sockeye have struggled. So does a tipping point lie ahead for Bristol Bay sockeye? A lot of people think that may happen, but just when, that's hard to say. So I want to invite our panelists up. We're going to rearrange the stage a little bit to get the chairs in shape, and then begin our panel discussion. And I will then shift into a question and answer period a little bit later in the presentation. So with that, I'd like to ask that we have 3 folks who are here in person, and then we have 2 that are going to be joining us online. So while these are being, the chairs are being set up, once again, I just want to say that we'll try to leave ample time for questions. I have to come up now. I think what I'd like to do is introduce those who are here in person, and then hopefully the split screen will be showing up our panelists who are invited virtually. So first, excuse me, we have Jamie Gowan, Executive Director for Alaska Bering Sea Crabbers, a nonprofit trade association advocating for crab harvesters. Jamie grew up in Florida celebrating graduations over king crab legs, and she thinks that that may be one of the things that somehow brought her to this point in her career. But earlier, she traveled the world as an oceanographer, running scientific equipment, and she sailed all the oceans except for the Arctic. She previously worked also for 15 years at NOAA Fisheries and predominantly in fishing quota programs. So next we have Katie Howard, a state of Alaska fishery biologist who has studied the decline of Yukon River chinook and now focuses on salmon's fate in the oceans. She began working for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game as the Yukon River summer seasonal research biologist in 2009. Okay. She arrived from Hawaii, where she had been conducting postdoctoral research on parrotfish. In an award that she received from the State Department of Fish and Game, she was recognized for groundbreaking research into juvenile chinook salmon in the Yukon and investigating the causes of their decline. So we next have Daniel Schindler, who has hosted us at the NERCA camp this summer. And he is a University of Washington professor who helped lead the Alaska Salmon Program for the university. And he spends his summers in the Wood River drainage of Bristol Bay. It's a remarkable gig. He's close by streams that each summer are filled with sockeye and frequented by a lot of bears. His research group seeks to understand how watersheds function in terms of capturing, storing, and transporting water, processing nutrients and carbon, and providing habitat for plankton, insects, fish, bear, and large predators. So these are our 3 panelists who are present with us. Now we also have 2 people who we're very pleased could join us. I'm going to start with Robin Samuelson. He is shown on our left on the screen. Thank you, Robin, for being here from Seattle. But that's not his home. His home is in Dillingham. And he is a salmon fisherman and a chief of the Kurion Tribal Council. He also serves on the board of the Bristol Bay Economic Development Corporation, which invests in crab and other Bering Sea fisheries and uses revenue to assist Southwest Alaska villagers who want to participate in the summer sockeye harvest. He was born and raised in Dillingham. He's been a lifelong commercial fisherman in Bristol Bay. So thank you, Robin, for being here. I know it took quite a bit of changed travel plans to make it happen. Robert Foy, he's director of, and Bob, thank you so much for being here. He is director of NOAA's Alaska Fisheries Science Center. He studied the impacts of marine heat wave, which has studied the impacts of marine heat waves in the Bering Sea. prior to taking this position, he was director at the Kodiak Base Center, where this shellfish research is carried out. He joined NOAA Fisheries in 2017 and was actually director of the center's Kodiak Laboratory and program manager for their shellfish assessment program. So those are our panelists, and I very much appreciate everyone here for being here. And I'd like to start it out by going to Bob. And do we have sound and everything? Yep. You're good. Okay. Bob, can you give us a sense of the overall scope of the warming event in the Bering Sea in 2018 and 2019? And what are some of the major effects that NOAA scientists in their surveys and other research have found that it had on marine life?
Certainly, Hal. Can you hear me? Let me check.
Yes, great.
Fantastic. First of all, I just want to thank you, Anchorage Daily News and the Seattle Times, for putting this panel together and inviting me to participate. I apologize for my flight issues today, but I'm happy that I can still participate. So you ask a big question. What was the scope of this event? What were the major effects? So I'll try to stay fairly high level. But as you mentioned before, what we experienced in 2018 and 19, and actually also experienced in 2014 through 2016, were what we call heat waves. These are extreme events. These are events that are, based on our 50-plus year history of understanding the oceans, longer understanding some of the climate variability, fall outside the average bounds. They're extreme situations. I'll focus on the ocean. So from the temperature perspective, and in 2014 through 2016, the heat wave extended throughout the North Pacific, commonly referred to as the blob. 2018 through 19, it extended even farther up into the Bering Sea. It affected the temperature and the surface of the ocean. It also affected the temperature at the bottom of the ocean. The overall impact that it had was changes in the ecosystem. We had changes in prey, for instance, important prey for different parts of the ecosystem. We saw differences in the condition of the fish and some of the marine mammals that we track. What does that mean? It means we saw, in most cases, a lower condition. It means they weren't getting the food they needed. It means potentially that their metabolism was higher than usual, and it meant that there may be increased susceptibility to disease because of that. Specifically, what did we see? Mass seabird die-offs. Incredible seabird die-offs throughout these two time periods. In some cases where hundreds or thousands of seabirds washed up on beaches, seabirds found in different parts of Alaska where they aren't usually found, and a lot of evidence pointing towards starvation. Mass strandings of marine mammals, ice-associated seals, fin whales, humpback whales, gray whales. That led the National Marine Fisheries Service to declare an unusual mortality event, meaning we had a higher mortality than we would expect due to uncertain circumstances. You mentioned salmon declines. We've seen extreme salmon declines on the Yukon River and the Kuskokwim River. We've seen the Pacific cod crash as part of the first heat wave in the Gulf of Alaska. Unprecedented movement of fish species that NOAA Fisheries are tracking, partially in the Gulf of Alaska, and most of the extreme movement on the order of hundreds of kilometers over the course of months in the Bering Sea. You mentioned the snow crab collapse, the obvious effect of this heat wave that's in front of us now. On the positive side, you mentioned sockeye salmon. There's other instances as well. We've seen increases of herring spawning and recruitment throughout the state. We've seen increases of recruitment in sablefish or black cod as well. And what this says overall is that this is a species by species impact, meaning each species is going to react to this massive change in a different way.
Thank you. And Jamie, I want to bring you into the conversation. For your members and your crews, what has been the financial fallout from missing the two king crab harvest and now facing a winter without snow crab? Are people moving into other fisheries, getting out of the business? And also, maybe you could speak somewhat to what are the main measures or conservation measures that you would like to see both within your fleet and from others?
Thanks, Hal. That's a big question. There are several parts to it. I'll start with the impacts to our industry and our fishermen. This has been unprecedented and catastrophic for not only the crab themselves, but also our fishermen. Our fishery is roughly 250 million excess of value annually. Given that we have 2 years now of low or closed fisheries, we're looking at roughly 500,000 in economic impacts to our fishermen. When you look at the secondary effects of that to processors and support businesses like shipyards and welders and fuel docks and the communities that depend on crab, we're talking about over $1 billion. It's hard to really understand the magnitude of this economic impact, but it's huge. And it's affecting Alaska's communities like St. Paul Island, incredibly. They've had a 90% cut in their revenue to the city. Most of their revenue for the city comes from taxes off of snow crab landings. So a 90% cut affects their emergency services, their ability to maintain their streets, their ability to keep their schools open. And it goes beyond just St. Paul and the Pribilofs to Dutch Harbor and Kodiak and into the Pacific Northwest, these economic impacts. Our fishermen are struggling to adjust. I think, last year was a shock. This year, I think it's sinking in, the magnitude of this. And we're hearing from our scientists that it's looking like it'll be 4 to 6 years before snow crab might start to bounce back. And that's if we do everything we can to protect the small signal of juvenile crab that the survey saw out there last summer. So we're looking for more conservation measures that can protect those small snow crab. And then also for Bristol Bay red king crab, which has been closed now for 2 years, how to provide more conservation measures above what's already being done, because we know status quo management is not working. So what else can we do to be protecting those red king crab? And that's been, we've been approaching the council process to work on those measures.
That's the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, just to chime in. A lot of people know the council, but maybe.
Yeah, thanks for that. So we're working through that process and then with NOAA Fisheries to see what we can get put in place to help these crab stocks rebuild as quickly as possible. Because if we don't start taking management actions now, we are going to lose not only the crab, but the crabbers that rely on this fishery and the coastal communities that depend on it.
Now, I'd like to bring Robin into the conversation. Robin really has a foot in both of these worlds as someone who's based in Bristol Bay, a lifelong fisherman, but who's Bristol Bay Economic Development Corporation that he's really helped to lead since it's an exception. It's vested with basically shares of the Bering Sea crab harvest and pollock harvest. And the mission is really to use some of the funds and profits from that work to help bring more fisheries development in the home communities. So, Robin, I think you have 4 crab boats now that you guys own. What are you planning to do with them? And then maybe you could also speak a little bit about some of the programs that you're doing on the salmon front in terms of helping the villagers.
Well, thank you and the Daily News for having all of us here. I've been chairman of the board of the Bristol Bay Economic Development Corporation for 30 years. We've invested in the crab fisheries, and we have 4 boats. We're looking for alternatives. as the season closed, the Red King crab fishery and the other crab fisheries that closed, about 85% of our income in crabbing is gone. And we're like the rest of the industry, we're in a survival mode. And BBEDC takes that money and invests it in our communities, 17 communities in Bristol Bay, and the people. And we're working to attain more ownership of permits in Bristol Bay, both to set and drift permits, get more younger people involved in the fisheries, do a lot of training for our people, and it is having a positive effect. There's over the last 2 years, permit acquisitions by local residents has picked up, and that's thanks to BVDC for helping its people. But with this global warming, it hasn't happened in the last 3-4 years. It's been happening, and it's been at a slower pace. Today we talk about crab, we talk about salmon. Our moose population is affected by it. Everything is affected by global warming. And it's pretty scary what I'm seeing out there. And the changes that are happening seem to be happening faster and faster and faster. And as somebody mentioned earlier, it's species by species that are being affected. Some species are affected, some aren't. And reluctantly, the crab fisheries has been affected greatly. Our salmon are being affected. Bristol Bay is known for its abundance of sockeye salmon. Our sockeye salmon have been getting smaller. Our chinook salmon, when I was a young gentleman in Bristol Bay fishing, it wasn't uncommon to catch a 50, 60-pound king. Now we're real happy to get a 20-pound king. Our cohos, our chum salmon is all getting smaller and smaller and smaller. We know that they're starving out in the ocean. And for some reason, they're not finding their food. We look at the release of hatchery fish worldwide, not just in Alaska, not just in Canada, not just in the US, but worldwide. And that number is gone to billions and billions of hatchery released fish that is having a negative effect on the wild stocks of Alaska. In the trawl fisheries, 60% of the chum salmon that are caught are of Asian origin. And so they're out there, they're mixing right in with Alaska's fish, the US fish. And that's got us very concerned. We've never seen this happen within our river systems of Bristol Bay. And you look at the Yukon, the Kuskokwim people, them people eat fish morning, lunch, and in the evening. They're Yupiks. They survive on fish. And to have a fishery closed, it's like taking beef from the white man and saying there's no more beef or there's no more chicken. That's what it's done to the people in the Yukon Kuskokwim, and it's got us real worried on what can we do to sustain our runs, because our people are sustainable on fish.
I'd like to bring in Daniel now. I'd like, first of all, to just ask if you could just speak a little bit to what you saw this summer in this year of this amazing return of sockeye, but also and some perspective of how this places, in the broader sweep of Bristol Bay history. I also was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the life cycle of these fish and what could be some of the main factors that could be helping them to seemingly prosper. Well, they have prospered, at least in recent years, even as some of these other runs, as Robin mentioned, have been on decline.
So that was 4 questions, Hal?
I know. Well,
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple points have already come up that are really important, and that is that climate change is real and it's happening in a big way. Second, that what we're seeing is really what we should expect, is that there will be winners and there will be losers as the climate shifts. One thing to keep in mind is the species we're talking about have been on Earth for literally millions of years, and they weren't on Earth for that long without moving their distributions north and south, without their populations going up and down. So we shouldn't expect that the world is static. We should expect that distributions of fish move up and down. Some populations will do well while others do poorly. That's just part of how the world works. And it does play out so that it does affect individual people who harvest those species in individual places. And in the case of Bristol Bay, yeah, people who are making their livelihoods catching sockeye have done really well the last decade. In fact, they've done so well that if we dialed back 30 years and said, 30 years ahead, there'll be 60 million fish every year for 10 years straight, people would laugh you out of the room. But of course, that's what we saw. And I think science will grope around for a story that'll tell us, well, what caused this? And I think we'll always be in the place where we're telling stories. The data speak for themselves. The abundance of fish tell you how many came back and how many were caught and how many made it into the watersheds. But we're never really going to know what caused these ups and these downs. We do know that sockeye farther south didn't do as well. Rivers that drained into the Gulf of Alaska, for instance, drained into a Gulf that was, both the Bering and the Gulf were probably about 2 degrees warmer Celsius, so about 4 degrees Fahrenheit, like Bob mentioned, during these heat waves. But the eastern Bering is always colder than the Gulf. So it's possible that, and most likely that the sockeye leaving Bristol Bay rivers came into eastern Bering Sea that was sort of in the sweet spot for conditions to survive. And sockeye leaving rivers that drained into the Gulf of Alaska hit Gulf of Alaska that was warm enough that the food wasn't there or the predators were stacked up ready to eat those smolts. We don't know. And Hal, I guess one of your other questions was, what does it look like in the watersheds in Bristol Bay? I mean, that's what is unique to Bristol Bay and in the global sense of sockeye, but those habitats are intact, those watersheds are intact. We've actually seen larger numbers of fish in those watersheds than we did this previous year because the fishery really stepped up and captured a huge number. The fact that we caught 60 million fish is, again, hard to believe if you dial back 20 or 30 years. So, yeah, the last decade or so, we've seen a lot of fish in those watersheds. It is remarkable. Hal showed some of Loren's photos here that demonstrate, the stories of walking across rivers on the backs of salmon. Happens all the time in Alaska. And it happens all the time in Bristol Bay because the habitat's good and that nearshore ocean has been very productive.
Well, I think it's remarkable to think of that scenario when Katie, you were dealing with just another wrenching year, and as Robin alluded to, in terms of the Yukon-Kuskokwim river systems, that you dealt with just another wrenching year of forward turns. And just, they're both Western Alaska salmon, and yet so dramatically different in terms of what's happening now. So what are some of the climatic and other factors, both freshwater and saltwater, that you think are causing both the longer term decline in chinook and then also with chum?
Well, Daniel said that scientists are going to tell stories, so I'll tell a story or two. So the story appears to be different for chum and chinook. When we look at the abundance patterns that we've seen returning to Western Alaska, for chinook, they've been in decline for well over a decade. The chum story is a little bit different. It's a much more recent decline. It's very dramatic. We've gone from millions of fish in, say, the Yukon River to a few 100,000. But it has only happened within the past 3 years. So that is, I think, a key piece of evidence for us as we're trying to figure out what the culprits are that are driving both of these species that are incredibly important to people in Western Alaska, especially for subsistence. But what we're seeing is evidence that very early in the life of these fish, there's a problem. So for the chum, and I think Bob alluded to this earlier, for the juvenile chum salmon, we're seeing that they have really switched what food is that they're eating in these really warm marine heat wave years. They have almost no stored energy. So they're at the end of the summer, they have nothing built up to get them through their first winter at sea.
And unlike these sockeye, which some of the research has shown may be able to switch to eating pollock, I understand that that's because the sockeye in their life cycle are more developed when they go out to sea versus these chum that are at much more fragile age.
Yeah, chum when they go to sea, they pretty much hatch and then they go to sea. They're not rearing in fresh water for any length of time. So they are much more susceptible to whatever the nearshore ocean conditions are than say a sockeye or even a chinook would be. The chinook story appears to be, and I can't speak for all of Western Alaska because the data we have is for the Yukon. But for Yukon chinook, there appears to be something happening during the spawning life stage itself that it includes marine factors. They're getting incredibly high levels of disease. They're returning to the river with nutrient deficiencies. But then they're also returning to a much warmer river. So we're seeing evidence of heat stress. And all of these things combined seem to be affecting Yukon chinook.
Well, thank you. And we're going to come back to some more of these questions on salmon. I'd like, though, Bob, to switch back for a moment to dig a bit deeper in terms of the summer surveys this past few years, and what did they find for snow crab? And what are the main things that your center's scientists think at this point that they feel are responsible for this implosion of the snow crab populations? I'd also like you to speak to bycatch from pollock and bottomfish trawlers and discards by crabbers and cod pot fishermen, and how much of a concern with both the king crab and snow crab at a low ebb is that?
Thanks, Hal. We're going to be here a while. There's a few questions there. Let's start back at the beginning. You asked about our survey, what we saw in our survey. Just to be clear, we're talking about our bottom trawl survey in the Bering Sea that we've been conducting for 40 plus years, almost 50. And more recently, we have been conducting that survey in the northern Bering Sea. And we're covering an area of approximately 250,000 square nautical miles, very large area. But we have a systematic survey where we touch every corner of the Bering Sea and most of the northern Bering Sea now. What we saw prior to the 2018-2019 heat wave was extremely hopeful. We had the Bering Sea didn't have the same issues as the Gulf of Alaska with the 14 through 16 heat wave. The temperatures were trending up, and recruitment for snow crab was excellent. We saw our highest year class on record prior to the heat wave. And that is us looking at juvenile snow crab on our survey. In 2018, 2019, we started to see the collapse of the adults. We started to see the reduction of the juveniles. And what lets us know that this wasn't just an impact on adults, that this wasn't an impact because of commercial fishing pressure, is because it did happen to across the board, to the males, the females, and the juveniles. 2020, unfortunately, we were not surveying because of COVID. 2021, we come back. 2022, we come back, and the decline is extreme. What we saw prior to 2020 was some decline in the juveniles, but the adults still remained high. So our catch, our tax setting, our ABCs, that's our allowable biological catch, remained high that year. And there's been some concern that high level of catch was too high at that time. But again, we have to remember that our catches, our management focus on those adult males. By the time we saw 2021 and now 2022, what we see again is across the stock size and sex decline in the stock. So what are the reasons? We've spent quite a bit of time speculating, as you will, at what happened, where did the crab go? Our first, and I think most people's first thoughts are, well, they must have missed them on the survey, or where did they go? Why did they die? In terms of where they might have went and why we may have missed them, people think about the deeper water. And in fact, what we know is that there's just not enough habitat to hide 1.4 billion pounds of snow crab. And that's how many we lost. We lost billions of snow crab in a matter of months. And there's just not enough habitat in that deeper water. There's been other thoughts that the snow crab may have moved north. We have our Northern Bering Sea survey, and what we found is that we didn't see a substantial increase in any of those sizes in the Northern Bering Sea. It is possible that some of these crab moved onto the Russian shelf, across the EEZ into Russian waters. We have anecdotal data from Russian scientists that the CPUE of adult snow crab has actually declined. And we would expect that if there were billions of extra crab over there, that those numbers would have increased. Additional evidence has suggested from 2014 to 2017 that disease has increased in snow crab. But again, not at the magnitude that would cover 1.4 billion pounds. There's evidence that there may be increased predation based on stomach contents from cod. But in fact, the distribution of cod and the distribution of snow crab didn't overlap dramatically during the years when we saw the largest decrease. Take that and also consider that cod don't tend to feed on the largest snow crab. They tend to feed on a very specific size class. It allows us to take scientific information. It allows us to look at the data and see that we don't have a smoking gun, if you will. We don't have one particular event that impacted the snow crab, except the heat wave. Take the heat wave and lay that on top of the fact that we had the largest year class on record. And it suggests that their metabolism would have increased. It suggests they would have needed more food. it suggested that they would have grown faster. And take the whole picture into account, and it again suggests that we reached a carrying capacity for that number of crab in those temperatures. And we have enough information from our fishery collaborations where we have observers on fishing vessels to know that it wasn't the bycatch in our fishery stocks. If you look at all the bycatch of snow crab, which we monitor very carefully, it accounts for less than 0.06% of the missing crab. Drop in the bucket of the total missing crab. So again, not possible that any one of these events was the single factor in causing the decline of this stock.
I think I'd like to let Jamie jump in now, because we do have a situation now, as you have indicated, where the crab are at a low ebb, and the question looms, what do we do now and what protections are needed? And I know that this is now a political struggle in the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, where there are industry, state, and federal officials. And I know that's something that Jamie has been knee deep in this past week. And some others in the audience I know have been very involved as well from other perspectives. But so where do you see the impacts on what needs to be done now to reduce impacts on the crab that are remaining?
Yeah, thanks for that, Hal. And I would say we've been more than knee deep in politics. I think we've been full up to our heads in politics here lately with fisheries issues in the Bering Sea. I agree with all Bob Foy's statements on snow crab. And I think above all, we have to lean on the science as we move forward and manage these fisheries. And, you know, I hear the comments that climate is happening and we can't control it, and that bycatch isn't what drove down, or fishing impacts is not what drove these stocks down. But I think our concern as crab fishermen is we need to focus on the things we do have control over, and that's really fishing impacts and habitat protections. I mean, there's only a few of the levers that we can control, and it's fishing impacts and habitat protections. So even though bycatch may not be what drove this stock down, we think while it's at such historic low levels, it could be impeding recovery of the stocks. So what do we need to do to further reduce bycatch in other fisheries and in our own directed fishery? I think we need to be honest about the impacts here and what could be happening, and we're looking across the board at all of our fishing impacts on these stocks in the Bering Sea. And then for habitat protections too, I think we're continuing to learn as we go, but there's more we could be doing for habitat protections. And I think crab's unique because it's also a benthic species that lives on the ocean floor. So it's almost part of the habitat. And, some of our concerns are that it has very vulnerable life stages, like when it gets soft shell on the ocean floor, and there's still fishing impacts happening on those crab, when we know other countries protect crab when they're molting and mating from fishing impacts.
So, Robin, can I ask you, when you talk to your pollock boat skippers or other vessels that are trawlers that you all work with or own, are you giving any special instructions this year to your fleet in terms of where to fish or where not to fish?
Well, right now, the pollock fishery, the offshore pollock fishery, is fishing in the king salmon savings grounds area. I think last year there was 13 reported crab. There's observers on the boat as well as cameras on the boat. I sat on the council for 9 years. I sat on the board of fish for 3 years. I'm a student of fisheries all my life. And if there's folks that are advocating to move the pollock fleet from point A over to point C. Well, we know what they're catching at point A because they're fishing in that area. We don't know the effects of moving them to point C. It could be an increase in chinook salmon. It could be an increase in chum salmon, or
Or
other
other bycatch that they're not supposed to get.
bycatch that they're not catching. But I think, global warming, we as humans cannot do much about it. What we're talking here is bycatch. Well, I want to talk about bycatch and interception, because bycatch and interception are the Mrs. and Mr. of destruction of fisheries. And we as humans need to control bycatch, and we need to control interception in order for the stocks to return to their spawning grounds, wherever they may be. And as we set quotas, whether it's a guideline harvest level for crab, whether it's a escapement goal for salmon, those goals need to be high enough that the stock is going to be sustainable and provide for the people that they're coming back for, both the sport, the commercial, the subsistence fishermen. And that's a human factor that we can do. Global warming is going to happen in the form warming is going to happen. We have very little control over it. But controlling the bycatch, controlling the interception, we have a lot to do.
So are your fleets doing special things this year because of that, since you have pollock boats? And
Yes, we are in the trawl boats. Chum salmon, we're reporting when we get into chums, we're reporting to the rest of the fleet to stay out of that area, and they're staying out of that area. In chinook bycatch, last year, the offshore big pollock boats caught 6,336 chums, king salmon. That number is so low from previous years. It's a blessing for the Bristol Bay, Tusculum, Yukon coast. But then you look at other fisheries, the intercept fisheries in area, I'm caught 19,000 king salmon. We need to control, to the best of our ability, the catch of interception fish and bycatch.
well,
And I was pretty dismayed in the governor's committee only looking at bycatch.
Well, I'd like to just move on just a little bit here to go back to sockeye, which have been the salmon that we, at least from Bristol Bay's perspective, that we haven't been concerned about how they're doing. So I want to ask Daniel the point that I raised earlier in the slideshow. Is there a tipping point? Are you concerned? I know you have incredible respect for the adaptability of sockeye, born of years of observing how they can shift where they spawn and how they do, how deeper waters, if or perhaps postpone their spawning season if till the waters are cooler. But as you look ahead in this century, do you see a tipping point?
Can I double down on one of Robin's points first?
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, I think Robin made a really good point about when fish are down, we need to figure out ways to take our foot off the gas. When, these populations, whether it's crab, whether it's pollock, whether it's salmon, when they're in a phase where they're booming, they can withstand a lot of harvest and they can withstand that harvest sustainably. We know that. But we also know that their recruitment, as we call it, their growth rates respond to environmental changes. And when we see from the numbers and the monitoring that their abundance and their productivity declines, we need to figure out ways to take that foot off the gas. And for salmon management in Alaska, Alaska does an incredibly good job at doing this based on escapement policies. We have escapement policies that are river by river, and if the runs just aren't coming in, no one fishes. And the watersheds get the first shot at the fish. And that flexible management is one of the successes, one of the reasons that Alaska salmon fisheries have been so successful. The place we're not taking the foot off the gas, though, is in interception fisheries.
And define what you mean for those of us who may not be totally up to speed on that. Where do those take place and what are we talking about?
Yeah, so whether they're sockeye, chums, or chinook, or kings, some people call them, they're fished in other parts, particularly along the Alaska Peninsula, where they're not really originating from local stocks. Many of those fish are moving through to other rivers. So they're not managed as though they're what we call a terminal fishery, which is catching the fish when they've already sorted out to their home stream. Like I said, the Alaska fisheries principles are generally let them separate into their home stream and then fish them at a level that we think they can withstand for each of those individual stocks. Can't do that with interception fisheries as easily because one, we don't necessarily know where they're going, so we need to start looking, and we need to start accounting for those fish and what they would have contributed had they made it home. And when things are booming, when you get several million chums in the Yukon River or the Cusco or the Nushagak, it doesn't matter really in terms of what those interceptions are doing. But when you get only a couple 100,000 in each of those big rivers, then every 1,000 fish probably starts to count in a big way. And right now, the mechanisms just are not there to let those fish count. So anyway, what was your question?
Well, I want to, I did.
Adaptability, the tipping point.
Well, no,
Yeah.
just when you look ahead, are we going to be in a place with sockeye, given the forecast for warming at some point in the future? And then I also wanted to let Katie chime in because I wanted to ask her, given the warming trends that we expect to see in the next half century, can the Chinook and chum of Western Alaska make a sustained recovery? What are your thoughts and hopes for that? Because that's a question of huge importance for so many people. And if I could, I'd like Katie to answer that first.
Predict the future. As I think Daniel mentioned earlier, salmon are pretty resilient when we have intact habitat and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of potential for fish to rebound. However, we are seeing these sustained declines for Chinook salmon, for example, and that is a bit concerning. The chum salmon, there are some glimmers of hope for those stocks to improve. We're seeing some indicators that would suggest that there may be some improvement in the not too distant future. But how that plays out, if we continue to get these really large marine heat waves that we know are impacting chum salmon differently than some of these other species, that remains to be seen.
And of course, your ocean research is trying to understand more about what is happening in that phase of their life that is much more difficult for scientists to monitor. Are there any sort of threads from your work this past year that really stand out?
Well, I think one of the important takeaways I've had recent times is we've had this really big international effort to work collaboratively across all salmon countries like Japan, Russia, US, Canada, South Korea, to work together to understand the marine life of salmon and to share data and to work together to develop genetic baselines so that we can identify where salmon are coming from. So there's been a lot of movement to work collaboratively internationally, and I think that is going to be really important moving forward.
And I'd like to come back to Bob for a second. Do you all model with different climate forecasts in terms of the global warming and different scenarios and its impacts on the Bering Sea? Is there any modeling like that going? Is there any modeling like that going forward? And if so, can you tell us what you're looking at? And then I think we'd like to throw it open to questions from the audience, and we have some questions that have come online as well.
Yeah, thanks, Hal. Yes, is the answer. We have a fairly comprehensive program that builds on decades of information that we've collected as part of our surveys. And what we have found is that the different ecosystems in Alaska are all reacting a little bit differently. As Katie mentioned, the large effort in the Gulf of Alaska, where we know there's differences in the east and the west. We know that the southern Bering Sea reacts differently from the northern Bering Sea, as you discussed with the different salmon species in their first year. So what we've done is, and this is through collaborative efforts with our partners at the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory, with the state of Alaska, other NOAA entities, we have looked at how these ecosystems function. What do we know about the production in the ecosystem, the plankton, the food, the smaller fish to the larger fish, to the marine mammals, to the communities? How do we take that information and then see what these changes in climate have in store for us? What we're doing now is taking predictive models, which is really where we're trying to get to, is develop predictive models that give us some understanding of what might happen as things continue to warm. As Robin said earlier, it has continually gotten warm in these regions. Then you throw in a few extreme events, and we expect more of them. How can we better predict so that communities can adapt, so that commercial fisheries can adapt, so that our monitoring to ensure that bycatch is not a large factor, or to make sure we better understand why our stocks are fluctuating is critical. And so the modeling that we're doing right now has gotten us to the point where we've developed them, and we're at the point of trying to implement indices that we can share with managers and share with policymakers to help make decisions in the future. And the key is going to be flexibility, as Daniel said, and the key is going to be adaptation moving forward.
And before we throw it open to questions, I wanted to circle back to Robin one last time. You know, with so many permits, and we really didn't set the stage quite right with terms of your villages, so many permits have, for one reason or other, either because residents have left these villages or people have sold their permits, so many Bristol Bay Sockeye salmon permits have left these villages over time. And the Yukon-Kuskokwim, when you look at how many people up there hold permits to fish in Bristol Bay, it's very few. So as in terms of trying to use the wealth that does exist now generated by this Bristol Bay sockeye harvest to benefit the broader Western Alaska region, including, of course, the villages in around Dillingham. Do you see that more could be done, or what do you think the next decade can look like?
Yeah, Hal.
Particularly if Western Alaska's salmon, chinook and chum remain in decline.
Sure. I think that Chalissa and the Yukon CDQ group, they could develop a program that they're buying Bristol Bay permits, both set net and drift, for their people in their region. You know, when we talk about Chinook, we got to talk about the foregone harvest. And the fishermen in Nishigak has foregone millions of salmon to help the Chinook regain control as it's been steadily decreased. I also know that the inshore and offshore pollock fleet has foregone millions of dollars in harvest to stay away from Chinook salmon, to stay away from chum salmon. And it's unpublished, but they're doing it out on the grounds as one of my boats may get into Chinook salmon and immediately gets on the radio and tells the other boats, stay out of this area. And they all stay out of the area. You know, I'm very appreciative of wherever them Chinook are headed for the factory trawlers giving up foregone harvest like we are in Bristol Bay with our 32 footers, trying to save a run. And getting back to your question, Hal, we have a number of people from the Yukon and the Kuskokwim that have taken advantage and have permits for Bristol Bay. And I hope that continues for them to regions to come to Bristol Bay and fish.
Well, thank you. And I'd like to ask people in the audience who have questions, could they raise their hand? Do we need to bring a mic around to them?
Yeah. Could I?
Oh, yes. Sorry.
This is kind of the panel's agreeing with each other too much, so I want to disagree
Okay.
with someone. And I want to disagree respectfully with Bob a little bit, and that is that, and I think it's worth us as a science community and as in terms of how we interact with fishing, the fishing industry, the fishing communities, is that we need to be careful that we don't overpromise on our ability to predict how the future is going to roll out. I mean, digging into the science and understanding how these systems work has a lot of value in it. I'm not questioning that. But what we've learned in ecology is our ability to forecast what the future is going to do. Our ability is really weak. We're always wrong. We're always surprised. And that has to be part of our mode of operation is be ready to be surprised. And to get back to Jamie's point, you know, the question is, what are the levers that we can pull on to protect these resources? One is protect the habitat, and two is monitor and be able to adjust fishing pressure appropriately. So it's a double-edged sword where we can invest in better science, but some of that has to be monitoring, and there has to be as much expectation and interest in being adaptable from a human perspective in terms of backing off fishing pressure when we need to. And also we need to protect habitat because that's what gives these things a chance moving forward.
Well, I'd like to invite any of the people in the audience who are physically here to come down if they want to ask a question directed to any of our panelists, and please come on down.
Yeah, hello. My name is Jimmy Hurley. I live on the Nushagak River, but I've been working over here, you know, at the airport clearing all day, but kind of tired. But you know, I subsist on. I don't commercially fish anymore over there, but I subsist this last summer, and Robin knows Klutuk. You know, Klutuk is a dog salmon creek, and it just dwindled to nothing this last year. Like there's just hardly any last 2-3 years. You talk about the chum, you know, dying out there. That's a very bad sign for the Nushagak River. And one other thing I think that really helped the reds coming back is water's been a little higher, and we have warmer water is bringing more growth to where like algae and grass, where the salmon could spawn. So I haven't heard anybody, really, digest that or really tell anybody. I haven't heard any biologists because, I'm kind of out of the picture. I've been in politics for 45 years, and I kind of got out of everything, but it's fish has always been my life. I'll be talking about bycatch in a few days, but I really appreciate you guys, bringing this because we live off the fish on the News River.
Well, thank you very much for your question. Would anyone want to comment? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good observation. Our long-term data on the Wood River, which is a trib of the Nushagak, since that we've started collecting in the late 1950s, show exactly what the gentleman just talked about, which is warming has actually increased the productivity of those freshwater habitats. Juvenile reds, juvenile sockeye are growing a lot faster now than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. And it seems to be a positive response to climate change.
But why would the chum not be getting the same boost?
It may not be in fresh water that the problem is. And the fact that the Nushagak chums, the Cusco chums, the Yukon chums suggest, and the same is true for the Chinook, they all have very different experiences in fresh water. They're all showing the same pattern, which suggests it's a marine issue.
We have a question online from Douglas Molyneux. It's for Katie. The question was, can she expand a bit on the issues of disease impacting Chinook runs in the Yukon? Is there something similar happening for Cusco and Bristol Bay Chinook?
The short answer is we haven't really looked. It was really fishermen on the river who raised the alarm bells about this disease called ichthyophonus with Yukon River Chinook. And it might be more obvious on the Yukon because it's such a big, long river. And the disease, once these fish hit warmer freshwater, the disease progresses much more quickly. So it may be in other rivers, but we don't know because it's not as obvious. There is some research going on right now that's trying to monitor ichthyophonus on the Yukon River. I think the most recent estimates were from this past year was about 40% of the fish that were tested were positive for ichthyophonus.
We have a question from Guy Fleischer, and this is for Bob Foy. He wants to know how, in terms of acidification, in terms of snow crab and red king crab, is that something, increasing acidity, that could be already impacting them either directly or through their broader food web? And this is the greater acidity in the ocean water that is also a byproduct of the fossil fuel combustion and all the impacts of human activity.
Thanks for the question, Guy. The acidity of the ocean, we know that in Alaskan waters, that in particular, that's acidity is increasing at a high rate. It happens differently in the Arctic Ocean than it does in colder waters, Atlantic and Pacific, but we know that those numbers are increasing quickly in the North Pacific. From laboratory studies that we've conducted for over a decade, we also know that we are very quickly approaching the point where the pH declines, where red king crab, for instance, are very susceptible. Juveniles in particular don't grow, have a high mortality rate. There's a little more resilience in our snow crab, so we don't expect to see dramatic changes anytime soon in snow crab. But with red king crab, we are likely to see changes in the near future as a result of the decreased pH, the increased acidification in the ocean.
Evidence, Bob, that pH could already be an impact in the red king crab struggles, or do we think it's like a future impact? And if so, we talking a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades?
Based on our laboratory results, We are not at that point where we're going to see major impacts because of acidification. Having said that, it's not going to be a cliff where suddenly pH hits a number and all the crab die. As the pH continues to go to decrease, the stress on the animals that either depend on it, it affects their ability to build a shell, or it affects their ability to get oxygen in the water, continues to increase. So that stress of decreased pH is there now. Have we hit the point where we're going to see large changes in population? Not likely. We're probably 2 decades away from that, maybe 3. But I didn't say 10. It's close.
I see. Yurth Rosen, a colleague of mine, she asked, can Bob Foy or someone discuss what we can expect in the future marine heat waves? At what point will the heat wave conditions be normal conditions? Although I would hope to think that they would always be sort of cycling through, but maybe more intense as the century progresses.
I can start. Others might want to join in as well. The patterns of the background patterns of increased temperature are not going to change. The slow increase of temperature. The background patterns of El Nino every few years aren't going to change. Right now, we're in our third year of a La Nina, which is likely going to go towards more neutral next year. That's not going to change. There's a decadal pattern roughly every 10 years or so that occurs in the North Pacific. So these background patterns are going to continue. What is new and unique globally are these extreme events. What we expect is that because of climate change, because of the unpredictability in the atmosphere, that we are going to see more heat waves over time. Will we see the peak temperatures we saw in 2019 as permanent? No time soon. But it's the impact on the ecosystem of those heat waves that worries scientists the most, because the data shows that if the animals can't adapt, if they can't move, if they can't grow, if you don't get enough year classes in a row to sustain a fishery, then that's when we have difficulty with fisheries and communities and large-scale economic fisheries.
I'd like to ask this next question. I was hoping that both Jamie and Katie could respond in their respective spheres. Herb Bagamani, he asks, how much of an issue is illegal fishing activity of any type, both in terms of impacting salmon and then illegal fishing that could be impacting crab?
You want to go first?
I'll get started on that question. We do know that there is still illegal fishing happening for crab, although not in U.S. waters. The illegal fishing is happening and happening in other waters. So I don't think it's directly affecting our stock. What it is affecting is our markets for crab when a legal product comes into the list.
Would that include the Russian waters? Any stocks from the Russian areas that might move back and forth that could be impacted?
Yeah, snow crab, we know, moves back and forth across the Bering Sea.
Okay. And how about Katie?
So there is an international effort through the North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission to collaborate with enforcement, cracking down on illegal salmon fishing in the high seas. However, we know there is legal salmon fishing in other countries' jurisdiction that very likely does catch Alaskan salmon. So there's perfectly legal, but still catching Alaskan salmon.
Robin, do you have any thoughts on illegal? I know there's lots going on outside of our 200-mile zone, but do you have any thoughts?
No, I don't on illegal fishing on the outside, but in response to Jimmy Hurley's question, no more chum salmon in the Klukak area. I went back and looked at the chum salmon catches along the peninsula. In 2021, they caught the most chums ever in the history of that fishery. And for the last 6 years, they've caught over 1 million chums a year. And these people used to have a 300,000 cap on the amount of chums that they could catch. You combine that with global warming, and it's pretty easy to see the picture of what's happening to the Kuskokwim and Yukon folks. And now it's spilling over into Bristol Bay.
Bob, any thoughts on illegal?
Only that there's a number of efforts to try to track it, try to use satellites to track vessels, monitored or otherwise. And we're also trying to collect as much data with our international partners so that we can better predict where to expect to see that illegal fishing, so that we can both address it from a legal perspective and better understand it in terms of what fish and animals are moving.
I also wanted to ask you about hatchery fish. It's hatchery salmon. At some point, do you see the need for more international discussion, cooperation, and possibly even limiting hatchery releases if we're in a period of severe, say, heat wave in the ocean, or just more broadly in terms of limiting those impacts? And how much of a dialogue are you able to keep open with your Russian counterparts through these difficult years, through this difficult year that's followed the Ukraine invasion, to really talk and discuss those issues?
Yeah, Hal, right now the dialogue is extremely limited to non-existent, especially for those of us in the federal government. With respect to hatcheries, I would say that dialogue probably is very limited right now. And to go back to a comment Katie made earlier, and she may want to expand on this, the international effort to better understand just how important that is by conducting these large-scale surveys off shelf. This was called the International Year of the Salmon. There's other efforts in the future have become ever more important. And again, this gets back to understanding carrying capacity. If we could even understand a small fraction of it to allow us to either have these discussions or make decisions in our own management, that would be important and valuable.
And Katie, did you have Russian colleagues on the boat?
Yeah, there were colleagues from Russia, Japan, Canada, from all over, and it is more difficult having these conversations now. And in fact, while we were on the boat, the war started, and so the Russian ship had to abandon their part of the survey. And NOAA did this Herculean effort to put in a substitute ship and find people to man that substitute ship. So they pulled it off, but it was very difficult given the current tensions.
And Jamie, you wanted to jump in there?
Yeah, I find this international work around salmon very inspiring, and I would love to see something like that for crab around the world. And we know different crab stocks are managed differently, and they're responding to climate change differently around the world. And I would love to see an international effort like that around crab. And audience member.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a question. I know we talked a little bit about trawling bycatch, but you guys mentioned pollock trawling, which is a midwater. There's no mention of bottom trawling. A couple years ago when when the ice went way north, a lot of those trawlers went north and talked about keeping the crab environment good. We let those bottom trawlers up there and dragging nets on the bottom. I'm sure that's not good for crab. And I'm not saying climate change isn't real and that's not affecting it, but I also think it's a little bit of A, a little bit of B. So is there anything in plan to not stop bottom trawling? Obviously we can't do that, but to maybe limit that, limit where they're going and to stay away from crab grounds, or is that just, can we not do that?
Bob, could you, well, Bob, you might speak to the regulatory part of it. I know you're track the council. Were there any restrictions? So there are certain restrictions in place, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll answer briefly, mostly from a science perspective, but there are a number of measures in place to protect habitat and reduce the impacts of trawling. One of those measures includes a regular assessment of whether the impact or footprint is changing over time. And we have found that in many cases, it's reduced over time. It moves over time. And that's going to be the key moving forward. And to go back to something Jamie said much earlier about the need to address fishing impacts is to remain ever vigilant. And collect the information that we need to continue to make sure that our observer program is there, to continue to make sure that we understand the changes in overlap between species that are happening, and that the questioner alluded to make sure that we understand those, to make sure that we don't get in a situation where there is overlap and there is a large impact before we can get in front of it. That's going to be important.
And Hal, if I could add
Yeah.
to that as well. I know for the bottom trawl, they have implemented raised sweeps, which have reduced some of the impacts on the mortality, particularly for snow and bear dye crab. So that's been helpful. One of the things we're concerned about, though, is impacts particularly on molting and mating crab with their soft shell. And we think those impacts are much higher when trawling happens from the crab are in that state. So I think getting a better understanding of where the crab are when they're in that molting and mating time, which happens between roughly January through June timeframe, where they're molting and mating and how to take fishing pressure from trawling off those crab. And, you mentioned pelagic trawl. We know that pelagic trawl is also on the bottom between 40 and 85% of the time. So I think that's something new that we're also trying to make sure that we're aware of those potential impacts on crab as a beneficial species.
Do we have more questions?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Phil Powell. Now, one of the interesting things I heard was Robin's comment on Asiatic hatchery salmon. My question is for him. Now, do those Asiatic hatchery salmon compete with Alaskan fish for like predating on 1-year-old pollock or so? And is there any place for genetic testing as a tool of bycatch management? And what could that look like?
Robin, did you hear that?
Hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Can you repeat the question? I had a hard time understanding. Please.
So you're asking what role is there for genetic?
Yeah, what role is there for genetic testing of some of these salmon species? And how can we use that in bycatch management?
Because I think there is some genetic testing going on now. Bob Foy just briefly might jump in on that, just to explain what they found, and then back to Robin.
Yeah, certainly. We have a huge genetic testing program where we are collecting samples through our observer program. We're monitoring all of the bycatch so that we can pinpoint where each of those fish come from and where they're going. And so that helps us better understand what we're catching in what fishery, what the potential effect is on that fishery species. I believe the first question was related to salmon predation or pollock predation. I don't have the answer to that, but we certainly collect that information. And we're working with our state partners and industry partners right now to improve the speed at which we can turn that around. Our leaders in our genetics program, Wes Larson in Juneau, have the amount of time that we produce the genetic information. And now others are trying to improve on that even faster so that the fleets can make these movements that Robin mentioned even quicker.
Robin, did you want to jump in there?
Sure, this is Robin. We do the Port Moller test fishery down at Port Moller, and that's the Bristol Bay Science and Research Institute that is part of BVDC. we've developed our genetic testing where we can identify the fish as we're catching the fish and bringing them on board. We do the genetic testing and we know where they're headed.
Thank you. Are there more questions from the audience?
Yeah. My name is Nat Hers. I'm a freelance reporter here in town, and have been struck listening to this conversation and over the past week at the council about the kind of climate change issue looming over this whole debate about bycatch. And I'm curious to hear from as many of you guys as possible what you think the obligations are of both the fishing industry and the scientific community to actually talk about climate policy and how much of an impact that has or could have on the futures we're seeing for these fisheries. I mean, we heard from Robin that there's nothing we can do, and I think we kind of also heard that from Jamie. And I'm curious if, actually there is or should be an obligation to be talking more about what we could do to avoid some of maybe the worst impacts from climate change.
Could I maybe direct that first to Katie? Because you're in this state driver's seat. So
Yeah, but not a climate policy driver's seat.
no,
So I feel like I'm probably not the best person to answer this question, but I'll give it a shot.
okay.
So one of the things, when I'm talking with salmon stakeholders in Western Alaska, one of the things that, I'm kind of focused on is having a discussion about, okay, can we nail down what the most important drivers are? And then are there things that we can do to mitigate? Right. So it might not be necessarily the big, climate change solving issues. It might be, are there things that we can do to protect the habitat in areas that have perhaps been, had seen forest fires and that sort of thing, where there's now less tree cover over the river. That we know does a lack of tree cover where there used to be some, we know contributes to increased water temperatures. So are there small things like that we can do on a smaller scale to mitigate? And those are conversations that are really beyond my expertise as a marine biologist. And so it ends up being something where we need to bring in other experts and also rely on local people to provide their expertise to figure out what the best plan of action should be.
And can I ask Jamie, and then I have to throw another question Daniel's way. So Jamie, do you want to speak to the climate? Because you're in midst, again, you're at the council this week.
Yeah, and we feel like snow crab is the canary in the coal mine. We've heard it said of climate change. And so how can we use snow crab as an example for how to build a climate resilient fishery in the U.S.? What are the tangible steps forward that we can start taking now using the science we have? And I think that's a key piece here. We have some incredible climate science happening, but what we're not seeing is tangible management measures that start incorporating that and taking positive steps forward or the levers that we have control over and starting to make some changes to help these fisheries be more resilient. So I think there's absolutely things we can and should be doing now as responsible fishermen and as fishery managers and scientists to start bringing all these pieces together and finding solutions. I'll just do a quick plug. I know Southeast Alaska has Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association is doing some really innovative climate policy work, looking at how to move boats to more hybrid power, which I think is fascinating. But there's a lot of great initiatives going on across the country for building climate-ready fisheries, and I think we need to be having these difficult conversations.
Yeah. This is for Daniel from Dan Dunaway. Is there any chance that the huge escapements of sockeye into the Nushagak, especially and other Bristol Bay systems, could possibly be a negative effect on Chinook's salmon spawning or rearing?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I don't think so. The question is whether the big sockeye escapements are impeding Chinook productivity, and I just can't see a lot of ways they interact very strongly. You know, the sockeye are mostly in the lakes, and then particularly in the Nushagak. The huge escapements we've seen recently have gone to the upper lakes. Most of the Chinooks spawning is in the lower river and then the eastern part of the watershed. They eat different food. Yeah, I'm just not seeing that as a reasonable explanation.
Well, I really appreciate everyone's questions. Do we have any more from the audience? Okay, yeah, sure.
Hello. I have a question regarding the interception chum. Is there any plans on doing any extensive genetic testing? And if you do, how would that look?
Again, Bob, I think you want to speak to that?
Fishing.
No, actually, that's a state question.
Oh,
can
okay,
talk.
I'm sorry. I missed the question.
Yeah, I think
thought they
the
were
question was about interception.
Sure.
And probably, I'm going to guess, probably South Alaska Peninsula Fisheries, or Area M, as it's sometimes called. And there is genetic testing happening starting this year. So those, as far as I know, those analyses have been fast-tracked so that they'd be available for the Board of Fish meeting that's going to be in February. So hopefully that will provide some more information on the stock of origin for those caught in that fishery.
And more questions from the audience?
Yeah. First, I wanted to say thank you to all of you for coming out here. I really appreciate the strong emphasis on science and the deep background that y'all have in that area. And I'm wondering about the low chum and chinook numbers. And are these fish that are surviving, excuse me, do you think that they are genetically different and that's why they're surviving? Or is it just simply the luck of the draw? And if it's just the luck of the draw, I mean, either way, they're trying to get through this bottleneck here. Is this an indication that we should be even more cautious about the interception or the bycatch on these?
Katie, you want to?
Yeah, that is a really good question that I don't have a very good answer for. I don't think we know if it is necessarily that these are genetically superior for these particular conditions that we're seeing or not. I think the hope is that if given a chance and given enough time, that all of these salmon stocks will adapt to whatever changing conditions we have. I think the concern is that these changes are happening very rapidly and inconsistently. And so I don't know what that means for the future of those stocks.
Well, I want to say again how much I appreciate everyone, all our panelists from Seattle, Juneau, and here who have participated. And again, to me, this has just been an amazing year to sort of explore some of these questions and get out on the boats. I really want to ask if it's possible for Mark Casto, the skipper of the Pinnacle, to get the last word. I don't know if he's still online, but oh my goodness. I think he can even disclose how he busted his Achilles tendon, but I'm not at liberty to say. So there he is. Mark, thank you. And thank you for being so patient.
Well, thanks, Hal. Thanks for having me on there. I tore my Achilles playing pickleball. So there it is. Cat's out of the bag. But, I'd just like to thank Bob and Robin and the other Jamie and the other panelists there. And it's been quite a whirlwind with with these crab closures. And, it's everybody's pointing fingers at everybody. And between the bycatch and the, water temperature warming and it's a lot of finger pointing. And I would just like to see some collaboration between, the fleets and the council and imps and NOAA and, everybody trying to figure out really what's the best point of approach, because, finger pointing and that kind of stuff is just it's obviously not getting us anywhere. So, it's the snow crab fisheries. It's been an important part of our family's life for, I've been going to Dutch Harbor since 1980, I guess. So I've seen a lot of highs and lows. So, it's not this is the first time that they've closed the snow crab fishery. So, it's kind of getting a big change for, not only me, my crews, our families. So I don't know. It's just
doing, Mark. Do you know what people are doing?
Yeah, most of them are going to fish Dungeness on the Washington coast. So yeah, that's a lot of my crew grew up on the coast of Washington. So going back to their roots, I guess. But in the mid '90s, early '90s, we had a 300 million pound snow crab harvest, and followed by there was a few years later, it was the quotas dipped way down, and then it came back a little bit, and then it's dipped down, and so we're running on these cycles. And like Bob was saying, the water temperature has warmed the last couple of years, but 10 years ago it was coldest I've seen in my fishing career. So we got like 2 years ago, in 2020, the weather pattern was crazy. It was the biggest, the storms were just huge. So, they'd come rolling through, and, typically in the past you'd get, winds that were supposed to be warm, but were cold because they were coming from so far away so, everything is just changing, and it's changing fast. So, I think we need to adapt, and the surveys need to adapt to it and take a different approach to it. There's lots of people trying to figure out what's going on. So,
well, thanks again, Mark,
we can
for
figure it out.
persevering. And I do, we don't have any more questions. I'd like to wrap it up and again say it's just, for me, it was just an amazing year. I felt so lucky to have this reporting opportunities. Thank you for our editors that putting up with us, and the Pulitzer Center for giving us some funding that might have been a lot easier for us to self-finance a few decades ago, but now where newspapers are is a lot more difficult. So once again, it's just been a real honor to work on these stories and to be with everybody here tonight. Thank you.